Well, good afternoon, good morning, and if you're in the United States, and good evening if you're over in Asia. We have very nearly 400 people registered for this event. It's going to take a few seconds for everybody to gain access. So we'll start maybe in a couple of moments. Okay, well, again, welcome to this webinar. It's being really sponsored by both UKinbound and ETOA to promote the Britain and Ireland marketplace, which is due to take place on the 26th of January, obviously next month. It's going to be the most important workshop that certainly either UK Inbound or ETOA is going to be doing in the first half of next year, in terms of the Britain and Ireland members that we have and the suppliers that we have. It will, I hope, be a unique opportunity for people to sell their product and for other people to buy their product at what is really a crucial time. It's at that time when obviously all the main intermediaries and operators are finalising what they can do for the recovery this year, and they're planning obviously their main itineraries for 2022, when we hope and anticipate that there will be a lot more business to be doing. It's at moments like these that tour operators and intermediaries add the most value. It's going to be a most extraordinary event, an extraordinary time for our industry. But to discuss the extraordinary nature of the time that we're going through, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Jos Croft, the Chief Executive of UKinbound, who's very much a partner in this endeavour. We also have Neil Aulton, the Head of Strategy and Insights at Tourism Ireland. We have Richard Nicholls, who's the Head of Research and Forecasting at VisitBritain. And last but by no means least, we have David Edwards of Scattered Clouds, who's also the ETOA Insight and Research Expert, our very own man. Those of you who want to learn a little bit more about BIM, the Britain and Ireland Marketplace, can either go to the ETOA website, which is etoa.org/BIM, or if you go to the UKinbound website, both of them have got details about that event. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard to say, Richard, do you want to take us through your presentation? Excuse me while I share my screen so we can do the... Sorry, let me go. Can you see my screen, or are we having a...
Can't see it yet, Tom.
Okay, no problem. I'll get there in the end. Sorry about this, Derry. We will be with you in 1 second. I think we're getting there.
That's good.
That's good. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Just proves it's live television. Richard, do start.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to give you a brief run through of the numbers. What has been the impact on inbound and domestic tourism value volume for this year, and what are going to be the short-term prospects for next year. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. This is the inbound tourism forecast for 2020. Now we've got the official data from the International Passenger Survey in detail for January to March, and then April to June at a very top line level. The survey has been suspended, so the ONS are trying to do some modelling work for the rest of the year. But this represents our forecast for the rest of the year. And we're predicting for this year in total a decline of 76% in inbound visits and a decline of 80% in spend to just under 10 million and just under 6 billion respectively. That would represent a loss versus the forecast we made this time last year of around 32 million visits and 24.7 billion in spend. So that's how this year has gone. If we look at this year for the domestic side, I should note that the inbound forecast is for the UK. The domestic tourism forecast at present it's for England, but we are working with Visit Scotland and Visit Wales to do a Britain version of the domestic, because the domestic tourism stats are devolved among the 3 tourist boards. But for here, we are predicting for this year 28.5 billion in domestic tourism spend, down 63% from 2019, which saw about 76 billion pounds. If we look at the pattern throughout the year, we can see, of course, the shutdown, the lockdown in April, May brought even domestic tourism to a virtual standstill, picking up into August and September, which looked like they were probably the high points, and then went backwards as the tier system started. Lockdown 2 starting to pick up again in December, although as we're seeing at the moment, London back into tier 3, so a decline on that. So the overall forecast for 2020 domestic is a decline of 60% for overnights, 63% for leisure day trips, but with very different patterns of recovery between the two. If we look at the prospects for next year, good, go on to the next slide, great. So this is the inbound tourism forecast for 2021. So our central scenario here is for almost 17 million visits next year. So that's up 73% on this year, but only 41% of the pre-COVID level. 9 billion in inbound spending, so up 59% on this year, but only 32% of the level that we saw in 2019. We ourselves only do forecasts for the short term. Oxford Economics do longer term forecasts. They're predicting that it will take until 2025 for inbound visits to return to their pre-COVID level, and inbound spend not until 2027, as some long haul markets likely to recover slower than some short haul. From our own forecast, we do a split of Europe versus long haul for next year, and we are predicting that it will be Europe is likely to recover in the aggregate. There will be differences, but in the aggregate faster than long haul, certainly next year. So we can see the visits on the left-hand side, the spend on the right-hand side, and so Europe back up to about 13.5 million visits in 2021, and long haul only at about 3.3 million visits. Similar picture for spend, Europe likely to recover somewhat quicker, we think. I haven't done any market level forecasts for next year myself, as the picture can change so quickly with government announcements, and you can see the likes of Australia, for example, likely to their borders to be closed for several months yet. Now, if we look at some leading indicators, I'm showing you here the picture from flight bookings from a service called Forward Keys, and they aggregate data on flights booked to the UK made through intermediaries. We are in fact about to get an upgrade on that data that will encompass some bookings made directly with the airlines, but at the moment this data is just through the intermediaries for each week versus the same week the previous year. And you can see in the last 2 weeks of data, taking us up to the 6th of December, a slight pickup in flight bookings, so minus 89%, which is certainly the best picture that we've seen since March, although only a little bit of a pickup from several weeks ago. So they're starting to see some signs. If we look at when those bookings are, they're primarily for long lead times, so 4+ months. So we're not expecting very much to happen on the inbound side until probably April. If we look at the next slide, I won't go through every single word of this in detail. I put at the bottom there the link to our page on the website where I look at the assumptions and the risks to our inbound forecast in some more detail. We're expecting only a very small increase at the start of the year, perhaps a step change maybe in April if that's when the tier system starts to end as restrictions start to ease, and then a gradual increase throughout the rest of the year. But by the end of 2021, we still don't expect inbound tourism to be even close to normal levels. Of course, the main assumptions here are around the progression of the vaccinations and the virus. We are assuming that in most advanced markets, vaccinations will be, if they haven't already, beginning shortly. And it will be the most vulnerable groups vaccinated first, potentially mostly in the first quarter of next year. But then it will take several months before the majority of the population is vaccinated. So it won't be turning on a tap overnight. And even by the end of next year, we expect it to be maybe endemic rather than pandemic. Plenty of other factors to bear into consideration. So the economic situation, large budget deficits to be addressed in most economies, new behavioural habits affecting leisure and business travel, some short-term, some others may persist, potential loss of supply. If we look at the journey purpose split, we think visits to friends and relatives could be among the first to recover, business trips perhaps slower than average, and holiday visits in between. Downside risks in the early part of the year, not least the Brexit. The forecast does assume that there will be a deal, fingers crossed. Risks to the second half of the year, perhaps to the upside if vaccinations proceed quickly and confidence returns. We will be definitely revising this forecast a number of times during next year as we gain more insights as to how the vaccinations and the virus progress. If we look briefly at what we think will happen to domestic tourism next year, so our England forecast for the time being, a somewhat faster return to back to baseline levels, although still we will not be expecting to be back to 2019 pre-COVID levels in any journey purpose or category of day trips. So I've shown here the holidays, VFR and business in the overnights, and then the day trips, the leisure day trips, and what proportion of spending is relative to the baseline, so the 2019 level. So you can see holidays and VFR coming back up relatively strongly, followed by the day trips. In the day trips, you might think that some kinds of day trips would be the first to recover, which is probably true, but other types like watching sport and going to live events, we're not expecting full capacity at stadiums, for example, to be back with us for some time to come. It's looking like, from what we can tell from the data, London recovering slower than the rest of England from what we can see. And again, risks perhaps weighted to the downside for the start of the year. I did these forecasts about 3 weeks ago now, and so they don't take into account London back into tier 3. So that's certainly a downside risk that has come to pass. But for the second half of the year, it's possible that confidence could return quicker than we expect. The assumptions for domestic, in some cases, similar to those made for the inbound side. You've got the medical assumptions are the same. An interesting view here about a shift towards localism. So in some categories, the decline in value shown by official day trip stats might be larger than the decline the sector experiences at some moments in time due to the definition of day trips, which need to be 3+ hours in length and outside of your local area. So if you think that perhaps a trip to the next town over for a longer meal might be replaced by a shorter trip more locally, that would then push that into not actually classified within day trips. So that shift towards localism would affect the day trip market. And again, by the end of 2021, we're not expected to be back to normal in any journey purpose or activity type. I'll pause there because I've only got a few minutes. Tom, are we doing questions now or at the end?
I think we'll do questions at the end. Thank you, Richard. You've raised a huge stack of issues there. I don't even want to go into any of the detail other than that's an extraordinarily rich presentation. I'd like to let everybody know who is watching that the slide deck is going to be available as a broadcast on YouTube, and I think everybody attending will be sent a link to that, so you can view the details that you've been given here later on at your leisure. I also want to mention that there is a question function that you've got in your toolbar on your right-hand side. Please post questions. We'll be delighted to hear from you, and we'll be trying to answer those. It will help us with the flow of conversation when we get to the discussion phase. But I will leave the questions. People may wish to pose questions to you, Richard, and I'll let them do so over the next 5 to 10 minutes. I'd really like to call on Neil Aulton, Head of Strategy and Insights at Tourism Ireland, to do his presentation. And if I'm able to, because I've got a track record of not doing this properly, I will hand it over to you. So one moment.
No problem.
One moment. Got it. Right, over to you. You can show your screen now, Neil. That's it.
Great. Okay, so you can see that, Tom?
Yeah, you can see that.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Tom. So I'm Neil Aulton. I'm Head of Strategy and Insights at Tourism Ireland. Tourism Ireland is the body responsible for promoting the island of Ireland. And the island of Ireland is obviously Ireland itself plus Northern Ireland. So we work on all the overseas promotion of Northern Ireland and Ireland. The island of Ireland actually has seen great growth over the last decade. So since 2010, we've seen 60+% growth in visitors to the island of Ireland. And Northern Ireland has actually seen over 100% growth since 2010. So that reasonably strong growth in visitor arrivals into the island. But unfortunately, as we all know, COVID-19 has pretty much put all of that on pause. And since the lockdowns of March, it's been really quite a difficult situation for the industry on the island of Ireland. Northern Ireland did get some visitors in the summer period, but Ireland unfortunately was subject to restrictions throughout the whole of the period since March. So at Tourism Ireland, we've been monitoring the situation closely, as you can imagine, probably very similarly to Richard in VisitBritain. We've done consumer research, we've done monitoring of all the different vaccines and so forth. So our consumer research, we've covered up to 11 markets over the period since May when we started doing this, with the most recent research done in 4 markets by a research agency called Red Sea. So I was just going to share just a small amount of that with you at the moment. There are, though, 3 key messages, I suppose, that this research has uncovered. So the first one is positive, which is the rare positivity with the whole COVID situation. So the first one is everything that we look at, we see the fundamental desire for travel remains. So when we look out ahead, we might look 2 years, 3 years out. We ask people about their thoughts and plans about holidays and trips away, and that pretty much mirrors pre-COVID situation. So long term, people do seem to be still very much having travel at the center of their wish list for the future. So that is a really good thing that we see. We also see a very strong desire for control of their situation. So the more control they have across the piece, so control over their booking, the fact that they can cancel, control over their travel plans, the way that they can get to their destination, control over their hotel, the fact they know what they do, maybe self-catering to give them control. That whole control does come through right the way through. So the more we can do to encourage them to travel because they have the control over the way they do seems to be very positive. And the third thing, which is quite obvious, but still probably worth saying, is that increased COVID basically equals decreased comfort with travel. So as the COVID situation goes up, people tend to be less confident, less comfortable taking a holiday trip, and vice versa. So as the COVID situation got better over the summer, we saw people being more confident, more sort of in control of the situation, so therefore more likely to travel. So that is, again, this message of the fundamentals of travel is okay, but the COVID is just knocking the demand out. So effectively, I've got 3 slides to share with you. So I'm hoping that I can move that on. So I can't see it. So perhaps, Tom, you can just confirm that we moved on the slides.
I haven't seen that, actually, I have to say. I think you may have inadvertently, that's it. I can see this. There we are, moves on fine. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So first slide, one of the things we were told and discussed with our tour operators and airline partners and so forth is that there was a lot of the sort of vouchers out there. People were putting off the trip that they were going to make in 2020 to 2021. And so we wanted to understand, you know, how much of a role is there to actually influence the destination that people can go to in 2022, 21, 22, and so on. And actually found that about 3 in 10 people said that they were actually certain about their destination, but that led us to 70% of people where there is an influence over where they might go and how we get them to choose to come to our destination. So it's definitely all still to play for. We then asked people, you know, a lot of what we heard was about this comfort level, about confidence, and how can the situation become such that the comfort level increases and you may well consider taking a break, taking a holiday. And so the things that came out, I mean, some of them reasonably straightforward, like lower infection rates, definitely the main thing, vaccine being available, and not just being available, but being embedded. So, you know, we heard people say, you know, I'll take the vaccine and then I'll wait 6 months and then I'll travel. So definitely the vaccine seems to be one of the keys for a lot of people. Insurance, healthcare, and free treatment. Again, this message of control. I'm in control because I know if something happens to me, I will be looked after and I can cope with that. And then testing. So testing is key to us with sort of looking at this quite carefully, how we can encourage people to travel through testing. And that seems to be reassuring to about half the people, and it's different in different markets. So we see people in the States being much more likely to be reassured by testing, and people in countries like Germany slightly less likely to be reassured by testing. And when we look into this, there's a lot of questions around testing, so it's still new to people, but testing is possibly one way to help those that will travel to be reassured. So definitely there are groups of people out there just will not travel because of the restrictions and the concern that they face. But for those that would, testing may help. And then finally, I think we can get carried away sometimes looking at the reassurance messages, but we need to remember that actually when we look at the motivations for taking a holiday, so why would you actually go out and take that holiday? The key messages are to treat yourself, to experience life to the fullest. So people are still looking for a holiday. You know, it has to be fun, it has to be worth doing, it has to get you out of the norm. So that tends to be why people are doing that. So, I mean, just to sum up then, so effectively we found that fundamental desire was still there, which is really good, but the COVID situation is absolutely key and absolutely important that vaccine program gets rolled out and comes through as quickly as possible. So there you go, Tom.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Neil. We'll come back to you. I now want to hand over to David. Excuse me 1 minute while I reorganize this. Sorry, I lost the people I need. Hold it.
Here we go. I can share my screen.
Thank you.
So I shall click on that.
Excellent.
And hopefully we are in slideshow mode, so we're ready to go. What I'm going to be covering in the next few moments are taking a global view of what has been happening and what is expected to happen, then think briefly about Europe before discussing what I have termed the fog of uncertainty. Then we'll diverge slightly and think what might the coronavirus mean for cities in the longer term, and then we'll present a perspective on prospects. So being a bit of a stickler for tradition, I guess I'll begin at the start of that list with a global view. So one of the organisations that has been thinking about this is, of course, the United Nations World Tourism Organization. And their most recent forecast is for a 70% decline in international tourist arrivals in 2020. Now, UNWTO has something called its panel of experts who they poll periodically. And the news from them is that they do expect a rebound in 2021. But with most of that panel of experts not expecting this to really kick in until about Q3 of next year. And tying in with some of the things that we have already heard, UNWTO is reckoning that 2023 is when the volumes that we witnessed in 2019 are next expected. Now, apart from the pandemic itself, this is not going to be a surprise to you, but apart from the pandemic itself, the key obstacles that UNWTO and the experts believe are hindering recovery are the lack of coordinated response regarding protocols and restrictions. That's been an issue from the beginning, and chances are it will be an issue through to the end. Also taking the global view is the World Travel and Tourism Council, and back in the summer they did a whole host of modelling, and unfortunately it now looks very much as though we are on track for what they termed their worst case scenario for 2020. What will that entail? Globally, around about 198 million fewer travel and tourism jobs, a $5,543 billion loss in travel and tourism GDP, all of that being brought about by an expected 73% fall in international and 64% fall in domestic arrivals. Whilst not all, but a large chunk of international travel is of course by air, and IATA have been busy throughout the year looking at what has happened and what they expect to happen. And they're reckoning that air passenger traffic in 2020 will fall by around about 61%, with revenue down by 66%, revenue falling more than demand because domestic demand in large markets such as China and the US has held up rather better than international demand. Looking ahead, revenues in 2021 are set to be 45% lower than in 2019, according to IATA. So yes, some degree of improvement, but still significantly lower than pre-pandemic levels. And IATA, along with many others, have been calling for an easing of restrictions, but they are now reasonably sanguine about the fact that there are likely to be some degree of restrictions throughout most of the first half of the upcoming year. Now, even in the best of times, European airlines find winter quite challenging, and the winter we are currently in, there's not going to be much in the way of ski travel, there's not going to be much in the way of winter sun travel, and as such, if you'll pardon the pun, headwinds are going to be fierce for many carriers in Europe. Going back to the IATA's view, they're reckoning that probably around 4.8 million aviation jobs will have been lost throughout the course of 2020. Now, I would highly recommend taking a look at the quarterly reports that the European Travel Commission put out, covering a whole host of different destinations across the European continent, the UK and also Ireland. And in their latest analysis, they've also presented modelling by tourism economics. What we can see here is the steep decline in arrivals to Europe in the early months of 2020. And then they have these three scenarios for recovery. Baseline and the upside see recovery back to 2019 levels by around about 2023, whereas we can also see a downside scenario here whereby demand continues to fall in 2021 before a more sluggish recovery. Worth noting, however, that this modelling was done prior to the somewhat better news regarding vaccines. On then to the fog of uncertainty. Now, forecasts rely on assumptions, but as a rule, there are certain things that you can rely on. So back in the day when I was doing tourism forecasts for the UK inbound market, you could pretty much guarantee that if you said, yep, it's going to be 2 to 3% growth next year with a margin of error, a couple of percentage points either side of that, you are going to be right. But of course, where we stand now, all of that certainty has disappeared. So in many ways, however brilliant the people still doing forecasts are at their job, this is what you might term guess casting. So there is a bit of a breeze starting to blow, however, moving away some of this fog of uncertainty. Certainly the arrival of an effective vaccine is encouraging, it's good news. However, we need to be cautious of what I have termed here optimism bias. Now, I am by no means a gloomy Gus, but one of the things I've certainly noticed during 2020 is that we have very often been hoping for a quick return to normality, and hope is important, but it's not necessarily the best foundations for a strategy. Another challenge I suspect we will see in the upcoming period is that as vaccination does gradually become more widespread, we may well find those people who have been vaccinated starting to take umbrage at the idea that they may still have to go through the process of getting a test, and even more umbrage if they're told they have to pay for a test to enter a destination where the health situation is still deemed such that those types of precautions are necessary. There are some common themes across the outlooks that different organisations have been talking about. They include that it will be 3 or 4 years before tourism is back to where it was in 2019, that domestic is likely to recover more quickly than international, that leisure will return more rapidly than business and event-related travel, that fully independent travel likely to do better in the short term compared to group tours, and that there's increased interest in rural destinations, activities and experiences. Now, beware of herd instincts. These are all indeed feasible. Indeed, they may well be likely, but just because lots of people are saying this is what's going to happen, it isn't a cast iron guarantee that it will happen. Now, this is what I'm terming long COVID for cities. It's one of the potential fundamental impacts of coronavirus. People in the future will still travel into city centres to go to work. There will still be commuters. However, it now looks pretty certain that there has been a step change in working from home. And that, of course, means that there is likely to be, in the longer term, fewer commuters. That then means that there is slightly less need for all of the office space that currently exists. And especially as so many businesses are facing great financial difficulties, they're probably reckoning, do you know what, we can do with a little bit less floor space than we've currently got. So this opens up an opportunity to repurpose some of that office estate, using those buildings for alternative uses. Could be housing, could be leisure. But it also poses a real challenge for hospitality businesses in cities that rely, in part at least, on commuter footfall for their trade. Maybe though, if we take a glass half full view, this may well ensure that those running cities will become more aware of just how economically important visitors to their cities are if there are going to be fewer daily commuters. So then, a perspective on prospects. Some of you may have heard me bang on already this year about these 3 M's, the essential ingredients for recovery: motivation to visit, money to spend, and means of travel. In terms of motivation to visit, I would absolutely concur with the things that we've already heard, that the vast majority of people, they still want to get out and about, they want to have fun and laughter, they want to see places they've not seen before, experience new cultures. That motivation isn't going to be diminished, even if in the short term at least, some behaviours may evolve. On to money to spend, and here I'm somewhat less upbeat. Thus far, the young have taken a much larger hit than the old in terms of the economic impact of coronavirus. And it is likely to be well into next year before we really start to understand the full extent of the economic fallout of what has happened this year. Yes, there is certainly evidence that on average, typical UK households have accumulated about £7,000 more in savings this year than is normal, but we do not know how they will use that additional savings that they have accrued, nor do we know whether or not, as unemployment starts to increase, those savings will end up having just to support people rather being used for leisure and travel. On to means of travel. Yes, in 2021, there will absolutely be some amazing fares in the market to try and get people back traveling. However, if demand does start to pick up, whilst supply is likely to remain constrained for quite a protracted period, we may well see fares actually start to increase towards the back stages of next year. Now, I'm being generous, so here's a fourth M for us, calling this one memories. And people go on holiday because they want to do things. They want to have lovely experiences in restaurants, go to theatres, go on guided tours, see attractions, enjoy the vibrancy of a place. The risk here is, of course, that if the supply side has been so eroded, there is a risk that that visitor experience itself will be diminished, which has problematic implications, because we all know that advocacy is such an important way of getting people to think about going on holiday. So then, final slide, and I'm going to divide 2021 into thirds. The first third of next year, I'm reckoning, is going to be much more challenging than perhaps many people expect. So again, people have been saying, oh, back to normal by Easter would be lovely, wouldn't it? But I'm thinking first 4 months of next year, really very difficult. In the middle 4 months of next year, there I would not be at all surprised to see a much more rapid return to international travel than many are expecting. However, note of caution, that may well reflect some of the postponed 2020 holidays, so people using those forward travel vouchers, and that pent-up VFR demand. Then the final third of next year. So this is the real litmus test, as I've called it. This is when we'll really start to discover the extent to which the economic fallout from coronavirus has really eroded consumer confidence and indeed travel demand, but lots to play for. Over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was, as ever, a very suave summary of the situation, and thank you very much, the panelists. What an extraordinary set of statements. I'm minded while Joss comes back and joins us. Really, I've just got a couple of questions. Richard, are you there?
Yes, I'm still here.
I hesitate to point this out, but quite often VisitBritain are accused of painting a too optimistic picture for the travel industry, and I often get complaints that you're painting something which is very rosy, which people find very difficult to match up to. I don't think anybody can accuse you of doing that on this occasion. I'm just really wondered, you know, there are a number of contingencies based upon your assumptions for recovery next year. And some of them are involved some optimistic contingencies. You know, you're hoping that the vaccine will work and will be fully accepted around about June or July. I'm just more intrigued as to, are there any really big upsides that you're almost suppressing there? I mean, if we have a return for, there may be real pressure on the airlines to increase their capacity up to pre-COVID levels come the summer. They'll be starting to jockey for position to occupy their slots. And David, you need to remove your slide if you can. You know, there is huge potential for clients to access what will be a wide open accommodation market in the UK. Do you think that would not open up more opportunity there? I mean, there's amazing scope for people to cut deals and make promotions and really galvanize the market. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, so I think that the risk, as I've put it, in the second half, some depth risks there. I mean, one of the, perhaps the biggest unknown that we've got at the moment is do these vaccines prevent transmission as well as prevent the individual getting it, getting ill? And you know, if they prevent transmission, well, that's the ball game, isn't it? And we can expect something, some pretty positive. So there are, you know, we put a central, and there are definitely a number of scenarios in which we could be above that in the second half of next year.
Okay. I think that was a little gobble, but we got the main gist of it. Neil, I mean, your slides very much concentrated on you know, the perception and willingness to travel in the markets. Do you think there is real pent-up demand out there? Oh, I think you may be on mute. No?
I have two mutes, and I have one in my lap, which just confuses every day. Okay, so we did look into pent-up demand. Pent-up demand is something that a lot of people talk about. Now, what does this mean to people? So definitely people are thinking, I want a holiday, you know, that fundamental desire to travel that I mentioned. And I do think a lot of people are desperate to take a holiday. They really do want it. So that is pent-up demand. But there's a lot of different issues, as we're all aware of. You know, people are concerned. They see the COVID issues, there's restrictions, there's airline not being flying so much. There's advice from governments and so forth. So I think all these issues come into play. But definitely there is pent-up demand for holidays. People want to take a holiday. Everything that we find says that, but maybe they want to take ones where there's slightly more open space, where they can have certain more control, and so forth.
And Joss, I know this is a real issue, isn't it? I mean, I suppose the question is we're talking about pent-up demand, but Neil's just raised the point that there may be a change in desire for what people want. Do you think this is the case? I mean, I'm asking you rather than me speculate. I won't put any more words into your mouth.
I think certainly in the short term, you know, and we saw it over the summer in terms of cities doing poorly, rural destinations, coastal destinations doing reasonably well. But again, there's a caveat even within that, you know, the beachfront at Bournemouth was busy, but if you travel back 3/4 of a mile into the Dorset hinterland, then it wasn't busy at all. So I think that there's a certain element of, you know, being a little bit conservative around that. I think also that the vaccine and the rollout of the vaccine will be a game changer, because that's the bit that is obviously the fear of infection and the fear of your fellow citizens is the bit that's driving that rural coastal rather than the urban traffic. So I think as soon as the vaccine is rolled out to any significant way, then we will start to see the return to cities. But of course, the return to cities, as David pointed out, is not just dependent upon international tourists. It's also dependent upon domestic tourists, and it's dependent upon those office workers as well. And I'm still not quite sure how we crack this terrible circle that we've got ourselves into, which is there's no supply and there's no demand, and because there's no demand, there's no supply. So I think for the cities, we still have a long way to go, other than I think that people will eventually want to return if the supply of the right product is there at the right time.
Cool. David, if I can come on to you, and it's not directly based around your presentation, but someone's raised a question saying that these projections are very, very generalized. And why is there not more research being conducted into different sectors and different markets? Have you got an angle on that? I mean, I know you're not in the business anymore of commissioning this, but is it generalized per force because that's all we can do? Or do you think there is scope to do some research into different sectors and different markets at the moment?
To an extent, some of the slides that Neil produced demonstrated that there is research going on out there that is looking at how are consumers in different markets thinking about travel prospects. So it's not that there is none of this going on. Some of it is going on, and the Insights Hub that ETOA has got is a good place to find a lot of that. But it is really, really difficult when there is just so much that we don't know. So there are lots of people saying, oh, we're going to reimagine tourism, tourism rethought, and all of these sorts of grandiose terms. because it's, in a sense, it's easy to drift into blue sky thinking, hate the phrase, but blue sky thinking when you've not got that real data out there in terms of what's going on in terms of actual demand, because either the surveys have stopped or demand has stopped, or indeed both, as is the case, broadly speaking, for international travel to and from the UK. So there is some research going on. Lots of people will pontificate on which sectors, which markets may recover more quickly, more slowly than others. But in the absence of hard data, it is quite a challenging thing to do.
No, I mean, effectively what you're saying is it's very difficult to make predictions about how the market's going to move when there isn't a market to look at. I mean, if you're looking at a 95% shortfall in volume, your data set that you're left with at the moment isn't very indicative of anything other than a catastrophe. No, I mean, I can see there is that problem. But I mean, if this is the conundrum we're facing, that if we are to stage a recovery, and that's the recovery is going to be led by the industry, and I genuinely think that the industry has got a crucial role in building a recovery up. It's going to be really useful if we have some data to play with, to know which markets to concentrate on, and to which products, which markets and sectors we need to devise products for. I mean, would you agree with that, Charles?
I think David had a very interesting one of the bullet points in his slides that talked around some of the supply challenges as well. So everyone's talked about this kind of, this pent-up demand, the future travel credits that are resting on the US operators' books, and of course they've got a choice as to where they go. But within that, there's also kind of the choice of the operator as to where they encourage / send their visitors at the moment. And I think one of the real challenges that we've got is, if one considers that markets such as, even Germany is 77% of all the people that come from Germany are using an intermediary, I worry very much that if the DMCs aren't in existence and aren't here and aren't able to service those inquiries, then the international operators will try and switch their passengers to competitor markets as well. So yes, the industry absolutely has a role to play in driving the recovery, but they need to be allowed to do so. And at the moment, we've seen tour operators and DMCs based in this country not receiving the support which we would imagine that they would merit, given the huge amount of export value they're delivering to this country, and also the fact that they've not been encompassed within some of the government support schemes as well. So I'm very nervous. We've got the demand out there. We need a functioning DMC environment to really maximize that opportunity. And then we've also got to get the means sorted out as well. If we've got a 5-day test to release system, which is being introduced as of today, that's a huge disincentive for anyone to travel to the UK thinking they're going to be cooped up, isolating for a week. So I think there is an element of the tourism industry, the industry really driving that economic recovery, but I think we need to be allowed to do so as well.
Indeed. Look, we've got another question here because the questions are all flooding in. Keep the questions coming, guys. It's excellent. It's a quick one from Manchester asking, what are the panel's views of the consequences of a slow recovery in London for the rest of the UK? We've heard that London's going to be lagging behind. Is that going to drag the rest of the UK down? Richard, you're breaking up a little bit when speaking. It might be an idea to block your camera. It might improve the bandwidth. But we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, testing. Can you hear me more clearly now?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly, yes.
Okay, good, yes. Yeah, well, we know that London accounts for around half of the inbound visits to the UK. So any scenario in which London is down the list and is recovering slower is going to be a scenario that's going to have a big effect, not just on the total aggregate inbound, but the knock-on for people who want to do London Plus as well, or to use London as a gateway. So yes, it's the evidence strongly suggests that from the domestic, London has started to recover slower than the rest of England. We don't have that insight yet on the inbound, not that there is very much inbound to go on, but I would imagine that it will be a pattern where that the inbound will be driven by probably VFR and outside of the big cities. I'd probably go with the consensus viewpoint on that.
Hmm.
We will. We are. I'm sorry, I cut you off. We are just coming out of field a piece of international sentiment research where we will start to get these insights in 13 or 14 inbound markets. It does ask about London, rest of England, Scotland, Wales separately. So early next year, stay tuned for that.
Joss, have you got an angle on that?
Yeah, I was going to say that it's relevant to the point I made around a functioning DMC environment ecosystem as well, because a lot of people, their awareness, international consumers' awareness of what there is to do outside London is pretty limited, you know, particularly the further away that you get from the UK as well. And it is the DMCs that drive a lot of outside London business through the tours that they're programming to the England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland of this world. So again, I do worry again in terms of the levelling up agenda that the government has to try and drive regional economies, that without a functioning DMC ecosystem, that becomes that bit more challenging as more customers are aware of London and they come to London alone rather than helping drive those regional economies.
David, this is not a new question of London versus the rest of the UK. Is there an angle you've got on that?
I guess something else that potentially is going on here in terms of London is whether or not London is going to be losing a little bit of its global gravitas, not primarily because of what's going on relating to COVID, but depending on how the whole Brexit thing unfolds, we may well find that the city of London is much less of a finance centre than it has been. That then takes away some of the business demand, the conferences demand, that then in turn calls into question investment in some of the wider transport infrastructure, such as, dare I say it, third runway at Heathrow over the longer term. So the risk is that this potentially just builds into London and the UK becoming less competitive than it was a few years ago. So that, I guess, would be my angle on what's happening in London.
Mm-hmm. And just to turn this on its side, if I may, Neil, I mean, there is this, there's been a long-running saga for those of us watching Ireland as a tourism destination, that Dublin's popularity was actually acting as a brake on the rest of Ireland, because a lot of tour operators simply couldn't find the space in Dublin in order to create a platform for the rest of Ireland. Do you see that there's going to be a change in this? I mean, is Ireland effectively going to level back in terms of availability?
Well, certainly Ireland would welcome visitors from across the globe as soon as it's possible to do so, and I'm sure you'd expect nothing else. I mean, we do talk about cities with the people that we do research with, and I'm not as pessimistic as a lot of people about cities. You know, I mean, if you talk to somebody in New York, a city like Belfast is a small city, so why wouldn't you go there if you live in New York? And we have spoke to people, you know, who've had a trip to Venice during the summer, and they had the best time ever because there was nobody else there. So, you know, it was almost, you know, it couldn't be a better, more socially distanced trip for them. So I think cities, you know, once the crisis starts to ease, I think from a leisure point of view, cities do have a good role to play. With regard to capacity constraints, I mean, yeah, I think we always could find room for people to come to the island of Ireland, but yeah, it'll be a good problem to get back into.
I think, yeah, so there's a slight fantasy at the moment, given the predictions we've been looking at. I've got a sort of concrete question here, which is that we've got someone trying to organise a group coming to the UK, actually Cornwall, in April. What do we think the prospects are going to be like for their ability to bring a group of American visitors in April? Joss, have you got an angle on this?
Oh, I know that the government, the Travel Task Force, the Global Travel Task Force, is one of the recommendations on the back of that was to look at travel bubbles So would it be possible for groups to be able to travel through England, and it is only England at the moment, as a bubble? I think the issue that we've certainly got, even in terms of a group coming in, is the fact they're coming in from the States. And so we've got to get the testing system either pre-arrival or pre-arrival and on arrival, rather than this 5-day isolation. I am confident that the government will move from its 5-day test to release system. And obviously when that goes, that then frees up the travel. I think the issues are still going to be that there is still going to be the virus in the UK. We heard about the optimism bias in terms of thinking everything's going to be all right and everyone will have been vaccinated by the time we get to April. But I think that Cornwall is in zone 1 at the moment, not zone 1, tier 1. And we'll wait and see where we get to in April. But that doesn't help the operators. I do recognise that. But I am hopeful that we'll be able to move either within the travel bubble idea with a travel corridor with the States, which then might negate the requirement for the isolation that's being imposed upon people at the moment. So I'd say definitely start looking at it. Be as flexible as you can, of course, but certainly worth looking at, yes.
I think it's really tough for someone planning a journey at the beginning of Q2 to know what the situation will be. It's possible because there's real pressure now from all sides to create a travel corridor between the UK and the US. The moment that is feasible, given that the virus is now rampant both in the UK and in the US, logic would point that you've got nothing to be gained from preventing travel between those two places. But logic doesn't run very strong in the current environment. So one would assume that by April things are getting back to normal. We assume that in April travel bubble arrangements will function so that you can run an American group from London down to Cornwall and back. But it is by no means guaranteed at the moment, and it is a really tough thing to do because intermediaries add value by planning, and it's very difficult to plan at the moment in the current environment. I'm just wondering, we've got people pointing out really, and it's an interesting observation from a leading sightseeing operator. They're saying, look, you be aware that all the bookings that we've got on that have been carried over from 2020 to 21. This is part of pent-up demand. It's hardly pent-up demand. It's demand which is there and it's just been transferred from 2020. Everybody who's rescheduled for 21 from 2020 has booked the same thing. They're not changing their plans at all. They want to do what they were prevented from doing last year. I mean, is this an indication? I mean, Joss, do you think people's bucket lists are going to change as a result of this? Or are we still going to be selling the same sort of product in 22 as we were in 2019?
Well, we've heard from from the experts, the insight experts today, that that there is a lot of demand out there. There will be demand for the UK and Ireland. And yes, people's future travel credits, if I booked to come to the UK and I was based in the States, I'd still want to do that. But if I have to isolate when I come to the UK, I'm going to switch destinations. I'm going to go to France, I'm going to go to Spain, to Italy, rather than coming to the UK, because I'm not spending 5 days locked up in a hotel before I can have my 2 or 3 days of holiday. So yes, I'm sure that the future travel credits, people will want to do what they'd originally planned on doing, but they may not actually be able to do that, and that's where we'll lose out. And that's, again, why it's so critical that we've got a slightly more competitive testing regime rather than the 5-day sort of test to release that we've currently got, Tom.
Well, guys, I'm afraid we're running out of time. This is a vast topic, a really important topic. Maybe necessary to have another bash at it in the near future, when maybe we've got a clearer picture of through this fog of uncertainties, as David alluded to. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, David. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, my partner, Joss, in this endeavour. Ladies and gentlemen, I just draw your attention to the Britain and Ireland marketplace, present on both the ETOA and UKinbound websites. I would just stress that I think, and this is my personal view, which I will impose on the webinar, that I think the moment the vaccine is widely distributed, we will enter a post-COVID world. And in that post-COVID world, people will not be worried about traveling. They will see an unbelievably uncrowded, unbelievably open, unbelievably inexpensive, I'm afraid, United Kingdom and Ireland. There will never be a better time to be traveling than in late 2021 to the United Kingdom and Ireland. And I think there will never be a better time to be an intermediary catering to that market. Bob Whitley, when he rang me up, the late Bob Whitley of USCOA, rang me up on the 21st of September 2001 and said that someone had put a package in for Dublin for 6 nights for $399, air inclusive. He said, Tom, that guy sold out within 35 minutes. America travels if the price is right. The world will travel to the UK and Ireland in 2021 if we get the product and the pricing right. I'm absolutely certain of it. With that thought, with all the gloom that we've got, this is available for all of you later on. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.